Hey there, and welcome to the Banksy and Perko Show.
This show is all about inspiring and strengthening leaders like you
to push back against decline and disillusionment and lead thriving churches that keep on reaching unchurched people.
Stick around, as in each episode, friends Duncan Banks and Jason Perkins invite you to sit in on the conversations they're having in their life and leadership, as if you were around the table with them.
Be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss a thing.
Now let's dive into this episode.
Well, g'day everyone, and welcome to the Banksy and Perko Show. So glad to have you with us again for another episode of this incredible podcast and show where an Aussie and a Brit hang out together once a week, and you hang out with us, you that are listening. We're so glad that you're with us. And we typically find ourselves talking about church leadership and life. And primarily, we're trying to navigate this kind of world we're living in where we're trying to lead both in person, which many of us signed up for, but let's be honest, we're also having to lead in an online world where many of us didn't sign up for that. And so we're just trying to navigate what that looks like. And my good friend Duncan Banks, all the way from London, England. Duncan, how are you today, my friend?
I'm good. It's very early in the morning here, but yeah. Like you say, Jason, we meet at 6 a.m. UK time every Wednesday morning just to do life together and talk leadership together. And I've run out of the amount of times that we've said to each other, oh, we should have recorded that conversation. Yes. So we just thought to ourselves, why don't we record it? And then it will feel like others have joined in this with us as well. So that's why we're doing what we're doing.
So speaking of that, what are we talking about today, mate? What's the topic for today's conversation?
So I once sat in a room with Andy Stanley, and he was talking to a small group of leaders about leadership. And he said this, and it blew my socks off. He said, when it comes to being a great leader, and suddenly everybody lent in because Stanley is an incredible leader. I mean, his track record's amazing. I want to be like Andy Stanley. So he said, when it comes to being a great leader, and we all listened in, he said, the questions you ask are as important as the answers you give.
Wow.
The questions you ask are as important as the answers you give. And it made me think, I thought that's what leaders were supposed to give answers. People came to us as leaders saying, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what my next step is. And we are there to give them answers. And Andy flipped it and said, actually, the questions you ask are as important as the answers you give. And he went on to ask 6 questions. He said, these are the questions great leaders should be asking on a regular basis.
Okay.
I'll list them to you.
Wait up, Dunk. For those of you that are listening, grab your pencil, grab a piece of paper, because here comes the questions. I've got mine.
Here are the 6 questions. I'll tell you what, I'll start on question 2, because question 1 is what we're going to chat about this morning.
Okay.
I'll start on question 2, and we're going to look at these 6 questions over the next 6 weeks, so keep joining in. The second question is, where are we manufacturing energy? As a team, it just feels like we're having to get pumped every time we talk about this or do this.
I've been in that. I've been there before where I felt like, I got to get up and just manufacture the vision and the energy today.
Yeah. You just smile, and on the inside you're dying. Yeah, we've all been there. Third question: who needs to be sitting at the table?
Oh, that's
it's surely the answers to the questions we have don't reside just with me. Who else needs to be around the table?
Yep.
Fourth question is, who's not keeping up? I mean, that's a big question. Have you got the courage to look at someone in your team and say, speed of the leader, speed of the team, we can only move as fast as that person, and that person's moving pretty slowly right now. Who's not keeping up?
On that one, Duncan, everyone else on your team already knows.
Exactly. There you go. Exactly. Yeah. And they're just waiting for you to step up and take a lead and sort it out.
Yeah.
Question 5, and this is so important. This is one of my favorites. Where do I make the greatest contribution to the organization?
One of my favorites. That's actually one of my favorite questions to ask. Yeah.
I mean, it just releases you. If you can know what it is that when you do it, you feel the pleasure of God and the organization flourishes. And then you can spend your time doing that. So it's a great question. Where do I make the greatest contribution to the organization? And the final one is, what should I stop doing?
Yeah.
We all make to-do lists, but should I make a stop doing list? What should I stop doing? And here's today's question, Jace.
Yep.
It's such an important question for leaders. And this is what I want to talk to you a bit about, because I want to pick your brains on it. The question is, what gauges should we be watching? What gauges should we be watching? You know, this whole idea of measuring stuff.
Yeah. What kind of car do you drive?
I've got an Audi A3.
I knew you were making more money than me. What gauges? What gauges are in your car? Audi A3. What kind of gauges are in there on the dashboard?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because obviously the main ones are a fuel gauge, and a temperature gauge.
Yep.
They're kind of quite important, and they're the ones that I don't look at very often, you know. But when I do, I need to know that they're there. And that's the thing about gauges in a car. You know, fuel gauge, temperature gauge, oil gauge. They're there to help you avoid breakdown.
Yeah.
You don't look at them all the time, but you look at them now and again, and they're there to help you to avoid breakdown. So I think fuel gauges in a car show us the importance of being able to measure how we're doing, so we don't break down.
Yeah.
How do you know? Why would you say gauge watching, measuring things for leaders is so important? Because so many leaders don't do it. If you were to say to a leader, you know, what does success look like for you? You know, you can see them sit back and go, well, I don't really know. I haven't thought about that. So why is gauge watching so important?
Well, I think gauge watching is so important, Duncan, because what you measure is what really matters.
Yeah.
And here's the deal. That can be problematic, because if you're measuring some things, your team and the people around you are probably catching the vibe that that's what matters most. So I think that gauge watching is important, because whatever really matters should be measured. But I think this is the question that it's going to take us to then. What are we measuring? Because we may be communicating inadvertently in the things we measure something that doesn't really matter or shouldn't matter. So I think the why behind it is, hey, if it really matters, then we should be measuring it. That's why measuring is so important. If something's that important that it really matters, we should be measuring it. So
Jason,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if I'm measuring the health of my car by looking at the oil gauge and the temperature gauge and the fuel gauge, it'll help me to avoid breakdown. But if I've got the wrong measure of health, if I'm thinking how healthy is my car, I'll tell you what, I'll look at the speedometer, the speed gauge. You know, if I've got the wrong gauge, then I'll make a wrong plan to continue my journey. And I think that's true of leaders. If we measure the wrong things, if we have the wrong measure of health, if we think, you know, bums on seats is the only, you know, healthy measurement in church, then as we start to make a plan to grow, we could be looking at the wrong gauges, the wrong measurement tools, and therefore have a wrong plan and not be able to grow. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's where I think I've failed in the past, Duncan, because maybe I was so fixated as a leader on measuring things like attendance or numbers at events, that kind of thing, and measuring our finances, which both things are important. But if that's all I'm measuring, then that's really communicating to my team, well, that's what I think matters, and what is the health of the church is dependent on those things. But nobody, Duncan, I mean, at least I've never seen a church that put their mission on the sign to get thousands of people to give millions of dollars. Not, hopefully it's not on any church signs, but oftentimes that's what it seems like is the mission of many churches, because that's all they're measuring. So that must be all that really matters to them, I guess. So I guess that to me, you know, is a sign of perhaps somebody that hasn't paused long enough to ask the question, what should we be measuring? What really matters enough that we should be measuring?
We had when I was in church leadership, we had a guy come and spend a day with us who was a bit of a leadership guru. And the one thing he said right at the start of the day was so helpful. He just got a flip chart out and he said, okay, around here, when are we successful?
Yeah.
I mean, what a great discussion. If you're a church leader and you've got a staff meeting come up, just ask that question and just see what kind of when are we successful? And then you realize everybody's fighting on a different win.
Yeah.
You know, because somebody says, like you say, somebody says, "Oh, we're successful when the room's full."
Yeah.
Really? Is our mission to get we're successful when we've got enough budget? Really?
Yeah.
You know, so when are we successful?
Yeah.
And then it comes down to, well, it's when, you know, someone will say when people give their lives to Jesus, when somebody becomes a Christian, somebody becomes a Jesus follower. Then you can start saying, oh, so that's what success is. So how have we been doing?
Yeah.
And so I was speaking to 150 people last weekend on a leadership academy thing that was being run. And one of the questions they asked me is, how do you measure success?
Yeah.
And I was talking about each department in the church having a win that fits into the overall win of the church. You know, so you know, if you're leading a small group ministry or a kids ministry or student ministry or whatever it might be, what's the win for you? To make it clear and to make it clear for your team, because then when you know what the win is, when you start measuring how we're doing with the win, then you can enjoy the joy of celebration.
That's it.
You know, you can celebrate to say, hey, we say this is our win. It's happened, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, for us, I lead an organization like you, and our aim is to help leaders grow their churches by reaching unchurched people. And we've got a little WhatsApp chat group with all our lead pastors. And last weekend, one of the lead pastors said, hey, we had 6 people put their hand up to say, I want to follow Jesus today in church. And everyone else in the group's going, wow, that's great, it's fantastic. And I just dropped in, hey guys, the dream's happening. We're growing churches that unchurched people love.
Yeah.
Just reminding people that's our win. That's what we're trying to do as churches. So knowing what your win is, knowing when you're successful, it means you're much clearer on how you can be healthy as an organization and make the right choices.
Yeah, so good. And I think, Duncan, what you're saying is then we really should make sure that we're measuring the mission. We're measuring the vision. We're measuring the values of our church. But all of those things are what's most important. And again, no church that I'm aware of has a mission statement that says we exist to get more people in this room to give more money, you know, than any other building in our community or something. So I would always encourage people to begin by asking themselves, well, what's our mission? What's our win?
Yeah.
And then what do we need to measure in order to know if that's being effective? And the reality is, Duncan, most church mission statements are an adaptation of what Jesus gave us as the mission to begin with. I think for some reason, we just feel like we could come up and wordsmith something better than Jesus. I think is kind of crazy, but I understand why we do it. But ultimately, he wanted us to go into the whole world, make disciples, teach them everything I've taught you, baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit to the ends of the earth. And so that's the mission. So what do we measure? I think we got to go back to our mission, specifically Jesus' mission that he gave us in the Great Commission. And then we talk about it in terms of our context and start measuring those things. So for instance, Duncan, I know a lot of churches have something in their mission that talks about helping people find Jesus and then helping people follow Jesus, or we want to help lead people in a growing relationship with Jesus, or something to that effect. And so if somebody were to ask me, hey, what would you measure then? I would say, I want to measure everyone's step towards finding and following Jesus. So what you guys celebrated in your chat was a step. So some people said yes to Jesus and they found a relationship with him. But before that happened, I'm sure there were multiple steps that had taken place that we can celebrate along that journey. And then there'll be multiple steps afterwards that we can celebrate as well. So that's one thing I think, you know, is important for us to measure, is every step towards finding and following Jesus would be one.
Jay, I think you've hit on something that is so, this is revolutionary, actually. This is so important. Because again, if our mission has something in, you know, the words around helping people find Jesus and start to follow Jesus, the danger is we go straight to, so how are we doing? Well, there was only 2 people in the last 3 years or something. And I'm not sure that helps. It's a bit like you and me, Jason, saying, hey, we want to lose weight. Our aim is to lose weight. And then all we do is stand on the scales and measure well, last week I was, this much and I don't seem to have changed much, or it's gone up rather than down. We're just measuring what's happening. Whereas if we're measuring the steps, if we're measuring the input, not the output,
Yes.
then it's going to be so. So if we decide that we want to, you and me, we want to lose weight, rather than just standing on the scales each week and saying how we're doing, surely the best thing is to say, well, let's measure how much exercise we're getting. Let's measure what we're having for breakfast. Let's measure what we're having for lunch. Let's measure how many chocolate bars we're eating, and try and reduce. If we measure or keep an eye on the inputs, then the output will change naturally. So I love that idea of steps. Let's what are the steps to people finding and following Jesus? Let's measure those, and the output will take care of itself. I think that's brilliant. Brilliant.
I'll give you a great example of this, Duncan, that we actually celebrated in our network of churches today, literally this morning. Like your group of churches celebrated these 6 people that said yes to Jesus recently. We actually celebrated today the fact that a high school friend of mine whose son has just finished and graduated from high school is literally, as we're recording this, driving his son to a university on the other side of Australia. While they're driving, I was able to connect this young man and his dad with a church in the community that he's going to be living in. And before they even arrived, a text message from one of their youth people, their young adults director, and they've already scheduled a coffee together. And this is a kid that doesn't go to church. They're not a part of a church, but they're not opposed to it. And yet that's a step. That's a step in the direction. So we're celebrating the fact that as a network, we would love to see every community of our country to have a church that even unchurched people would love to engage with. And it's happening. That's happening. Like you said, the dream is happening. And so
I love that.
Celebrating every step. Yeah.
That's made my day, that has. That is a great story. I love that. So we used to measure the whole ABC, attendance, buildings and cash. That was how we judged how successful we are. How are the buildings doing? What are the bums on seats numbers like, and how we're doing with the bank account? And that's as far as our success measures went. With the whole hybrid church thing, that's thrown that into the mix a bit. So how does a leader measure how successful they were last Sunday? How do they measure how successful? I mean, get specific. What kind of things should we be measuring?
So Duncan, if I want to move people from, say, somebody that's just started watching to actually engage with our church, I think I've got to start to look at, well, what are the steps that somebody in my community might take in a digital sense to engage with us and begin to find and follow Jesus, just like what are the steps that somebody might do that physically. So they might get invited to the church, and then they might come and check us out, and then they might join a group, or they might do whatever. And I think we just have to say, okay, well, what is the pathway then for finding and following Jesus look like on a digital continuum? So for instance, it might start with, Duncan, a friend of theirs posting something on their Instagram account from our church, and now their entire network is aware that our church even exists. Yeah. So, and it may not necessarily be an invite to church. It might just be something that maybe we're doing in the community, or maybe another organization that we're promoting in the community. But that first step of awareness, I think, is probably the big one in the digital world. Then I think people start, if we're talking steps digitally, I think people go from aware of us to maybe start following us a little bit. And, you know, they might follow the church account, or they might follow, you know, your friend or whoever it is. And as they start to follow, maybe they start to actually engage in some of the content, or we can invite them to engage. And so that might look like commenting on something or liking something. And then it might be that they actually directly message us, or they get engaged in a conversation. All of these things, Duncan, I think we should be measuring, not just the follows and the likes, but every step along the pathway. And keep in mind that long before somebody becomes a fan of what you're doing and starts reposting your stuff digitally, or starts attending your church physically from a digital engagement, long before that, they've taken many steps in the process to finding and following Jesus and finding and following your church. So I think just like the physical, Duncan,
Yeah.
We've got to start saying, okay, what are the steps for somebody to find and follow Jesus in the digital world? And can we measure and celebrate those steps along the pathway as well?
Yeah, I love that. That's so helpful. Because if our mission is life change, like you jokingly said earlier on, it's not about how many people come or how big the bank balance is. That can't be our mission, but that seems to be the thing we always measure. But if our mission is genuinely a life change, a big crowd on a Sunday doesn't mean life change. But those little steps of people beginning to like and comment and follow, those little steps of people beginning to become aware of who we are, they're all heading towards the big goal of life change. I like that. I was so lucky. It was before COVID. I was so lucky. I went to Brownsbridge Church, which is one of North Point's Atlanta area churches. Big church. I mean, there must have been about 2,000 or 3,000 people and three services a day. When I went, it was huge. And I managed to get a cup of coffee with Adam Johnson, who's the lead pastor there. Really, really good leader. Great guy. Really inspiring guy. And I said to him, how do you know how many of these people that are turning up in the building, how do you know how many are your regulars and how many are new people? Because most churches, I don't know what it's like in Australia and New Zealand, but in Ireland and the UK, the average size of a church is about 80 or 100 people. So the pastor kind of knows everybody. Yeah. So when you got 3,000, it's a bit harder to know everybody. So Adam said, it's interesting. He said, one of the things we've discovered is we have free Wi-Fi. Excuse me. He said we have free Wi-Fi, and so I don't know how someone much cleverer than me can figure this out, but he said we know when there's a new IP address attached to our Wi-Fi. Yeah. So it's not hard and fast because you could have changed your provider.
Yeah.
But most people don't. So he says we can tell out of the crowd, everyone's phone that comes in that connects to our Wi-Fi, we can tell how many we've had before and how many are brand new connections. Yeah. And when those numbers fluctuate up and down, we can tell whether what we're doing works and what we're doing doesn't work. And he said also they do an annual survey, just a one-hit moment where they ask 4 questions. There's a sheet of paper for those who attend regularly and for those who are new attenders, and you just fill it in really quickly. It's anonymous, and they call a regular attender someone who's been more than 4 times a year.
Okay.
So anybody else, a new person, and you just get a snapshot of what visitors think and are visitors there. I thought that was quite an interesting way of beginning to think about some of the inputs.
Absolutely. So Duncan, let me ask you a question. If we were going to pick just say 2 or 3 gauges, like fuel, oil, temperature, because maybe you're listening to the podcast and you're just like, oh, this is overwhelming. Can you guys just give me 2 or 3 gauges I should go back and pay attention to that are not attendance, buildings, and cash?
Yeah.
What would you pick if you had to pick only 2 or 3?
I mean, that's a great question. I think we often say when we have conversations together that everything rises and falls on leadership.
Yeah.
So you could put as a gauge, you could put leaders versus apprentices. Yeah. We're never going to keep growing if we don't grow our leaders, and the only way we're going to grow our leaders is if a leader has an apprentice who can do what they do and puts them in that place. So one of the measurement tools could be, are our leaders growing apprentices? How many apprentice leaders are becoming leaders?
Yeah.
Because everything rises and falls on leadership. I think another gauge to watch, you have to have a gauge that looks at small group versus big group, whether it's digital or physical. We have this many attendees, this many views. What percentage of those people are actually in some kind of a relationally connected group? So I think you have to measure something big group versus the small group. Yeah. I love. I'm going to ask you the same question as well. So I'm probably stealing all the ideas as we go. But I love, again, I learned this from talking to people at North Point. They talk about they don't have membership, but how do they know whether someone's connected to their church and their church mission? They talk about 4 things. They talk about, is she serving? Is she giving? Is she in a group? They're the basic 3. Have they found their place and are they serving? are they giving and are they in a group? I mean, the thing is, if you looked at it, you could say, let me look at Jason then. So Jason gives and Jason's in a group, but he's not serving. So then I can tailor something specific. I can come to you and say, we're so grateful that you're part of our church, that you give in our church, that I know you love your small group, but can I help you to find your place in serving? Because I think you could add a lot to our mission, kind of thing. Yeah. And they talk about the fourth thing being inviting. Is Jason inviting? Yeah. And these days, I think maybe you could swap that word out for sharing. Does Jason repost? Does Jason retweet? Does Jason share some of the stuff we put out? Yeah. So they're the kind of things that maybe are worth looking at.
Yeah.
What about you? What would you say?
Duncan, I think I really would go back to the mission and say, can we somehow quantify steps that people are taking to find Jesus? Can we measure that and say, hey, we know that this week or this month we can identify multiple people that are taking steps towards finding Jesus, both digitally and in person. So that would be one of the ones that I would want to measure. And then I would want to measure people growing in their following of Jesus. And so how can we do that with steps? And I think some of the things that you've referred to, Duncan, serving, being generous, maybe being a part of a small group, those are things that help to measure people finding and following Jesus. But then the last one, and I'm going to be completely honest, Duncan, I don't have a good answer to how do you measure this, but this is something that I'm wrestling with right now. I think that a healthy church is one that is growing in their love for each other and their love for the community and their love for God. And probably in the other order, love for God, love for each other, love for the community. I think that's the mark of a healthy follower of Jesus, but also a healthy church. And so, man, I would say if we could really start to say, okay, can we measure growth in our love for God as a community, our love for one another, and our love for the community, then I think that would be a game changer, wouldn't it?
That would be a really important gauge to watch, wouldn't it? Yeah. But and that's the fun of leadership, because you say that and it makes me think, I would love to get a bunch of people round a table and say, what are the steps we need to put in place to help people be more loving towards their Heavenly Father, loving towards each other, and loving towards the lost that surround them. Yeah. That's the fun of leadership, figuring out what that looks like and then going after it.
Yeah, I just go back to two things that Jesus said, Duncan, in the response to what's the greatest commandment, or maybe it was another way to ask that question is, what's the biggest thing we should measure? Jesus said it's loving God and loving others. And then he followed that up later with they'll know us by the way that we love one another. They'll know. It'll be dead obvious to people by the way we love each other that we're followers of Jesus. And so, man, I just wonder if there's, like you said, some leaders that would gather around in their context and say, well, what does that mean to measure that love for God, love for each other, and love for the community? Yeah. So, Duncan, if asking the right questions is so important, mate, to good leadership, what questions are you asking yourself these days? Not your organization, but just you personally.
Now you're getting personal. Let me tell you something. I've not told anybody this. I've written it down on my pad, and I come to it every morning when I sit at my desk here. I asked myself, I've been trying this the last few weeks, and it's been amazing. It's been energy giving. I just asked myself the question, what would make today great?
Wow, that's a good question, yeah.
What would make today great? And it might just be a walk with the dog. It might be picking up the phone and talking to Jason. It might be completing that project that I've had on the back burner for so long. And I know that I'll feel great and today will be successful if I get that thing done.
Yeah.
And so naming it, writing it down on a pad every morning, as small or as big as it might be, is a real energy giver. It really boosts your energy and gives you a sense of focus. So asking myself that question has been great. I mean, in general, a question I ask myself on quite a consistent basis. So last week I had an annual appraisal, like all leaders do, with the chairman of the board of the Further Faster network that I work for. And I said to him then, I said, frequently I ask myself this question, not on a daily basis, but on a regular basis. If someone replaced me, what's the first thing they would change?
Yeah.
You know, and that's quite, as a leader, that's quite a revealing question. If somebody was about to replace me, what's the first thing they would change?
Yeah.
And it's helped me realize, you know, why do I do that? Why do we do that? That's crazy. It's just kind of happened. If a leader came in and took my place now, they would scrap that, or they would reintroduce that, or they would sharpen that, or they would put more resources behind that. So asking that question, I think has been quite an eye-opener on a leadership level. And then asking them what would make today great on a daily personal level has been great for me. How about you? I mean, I know you're a great question asker. What kind of questions do you ask personally as a leader?
Duncan, I have a very weird morning ritual. So I'm just going to say it up front. I decided several years ago that I wanted to focus more on who I was becoming, or what I want to become, rather than what I want to get done. And so I ask myself, every morning I ask myself, who do I want to become? And I remind myself of what I call my life manifesto, kind of my eulogy exercise. And I just have 10 areas of my life that I've decided with 2 or 3 words who I want to become, not what I want to get done. And so I asked myself this question though, Duncan: what do I need to do today to become that person, you know, in my eulogy?
That's great.
And so I oftentimes will, like you, I'll end up doing something that day. It might be small or it might be big, that helps me to become that person that I want to become. At the end of my days, I've got 10 people that might stand up at my funeral and give a few words. And so I've written down what few words I want them to give.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. What do I want to become is more important than what do I want to get done. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Now, I will say this, Duncan. In order to become someone, you do have to get up off the couch and get something done eventually. But I think that thinking about who you want to become will then inform the things that you go and get done. And if you think about it that way instead of the other way around, I think you'll probably get to the end of your life and actually be the person that you wanted to be.
It's so true, isn't it? Because the leaders that we follow, the leaders that we love, it's less about their track record of achievements, and it's more about, you know, oh, they're so kind. Yeah. They give me so much time. They're interested in me. They have such great relationships that I would love to copy and mimic. And it's about who they are under the surface that's more attractive to us than maybe their record book of great achievements. Yeah, I love that. Hey, Jace, what a great conversation this has been. Let me tell you where we're going next week so you can get a bit of a heads up. So when I get up at 6 a.m. next week to talk to you, we've got a few ideas running about. Andy's second question was, where are we manufacturing energy?
Yeah.
What a great question for a leader to ask. Have a think on that. And maybe if you're listening to this, let us know where are you manufacturing energy right now? You know, where do you feel you have to just stoke the boiler with a real sense of every time you get up and talk about it or plan towards it? Because that should ring in a little alarm bell if you're manufacturing energy around those things all the time. So let's talk about that next week when we're together, huh?
Let's talk about it next week, Duncan. But let's keep this conversation going all week long online. In fact, if you're listening, I'd love to know, did we miss any gauges that we should be talking about that you are measuring, that you would say, hey, Perko or Banksy, you missed this one? Or maybe you've got a comment or maybe a correction on something that we've said today. We don't think we've got the corner on the market in the answers to these questions, but we think collectively we may come up with some great answers to these questions, and that's where we need your voice. So jump onto social media. Primarily Instagram is the best place to find us, at Banksy and Perko Show. That's where you'll find us on Instagram. Shoot us a DM, comment on our posts, connect with us that way. We'd love to keep the conversation going. And like Duncan said, we want to know, what's your answer to Where are you manufacturing energy these days? And we'll continue that conversation next week. Have a great week, everyone.
G'day.
So that's it, folks. You've been listening to the Banksy and Perko Show.
And we hope sitting in on that conversation has inspired and strengthened you in your life and leadership.
If you want to get into Banksy and Perko's contacts, then hit the link in the show notes to subscribe to the mailing list,
where they'll send out episode updates
and additional content and resources from time to time.
And of course, hit subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss an episode.
Duncan Banks is director of the Further Faster Network in the UK and Ireland.
Jason Perkins is director of the Irresistible Churches Network in Australasia.
If you are a church leader in any of those regions of the globe and looking to explore what it would take to reach the unchurched people in your community, then they're your guys.
Check out the ways to reach them in the show notes. See you next time.